When documentary evidence is missing or incomplete, where do you start when looking at strategies to get around it?
Well, it depends, as you mentioned before, on what evidence it is that's missing. If it's an absence of the person's medical records from the time in service, the court has held that there is a heightened duty on the VA to look at other evidence and to document their conclusions about alternative evidence, because as you alluded to, back in the 70s there was a fire at the main record repository in St. Louis, Missouri that destroyed the records of a number of veterans, particularly Army veterans, also some other services, but primarily Army.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking veterans' disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for VA disability benefits, be sure to subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. Hi there, I'm Francis Jackson, this is Kristian Terison, and we're veterans disability attorneys at Jackson and MacNichol. We've helped thousands of veterans to win literally millions of dollars in benefits. And we created this podcast as a resource for veterans who are applying for VA disability benefits. But it's also not just for veterans, but for anyone with an interest in veterans' disability issues. Whether you're a family member, a relative, a friend, just a member of the community who wants to support veterans and wants to understand more about VA disability benefits. We welcome you to our podcast, and today we're going to talk about one of the things that I think makes VA disability lawyers special. We're going to talk about creativity and evidence.
And it's actually one of my favorite parts of the job because, if there's one unifying characteristic across many of the cases we get, it's some fundamental deficiency in evidence. Whether it's the National Personnel Records Center burning down and records moldering, or, it wasn't in the filing cabinet where it was supposed to be, etc., etc. We're always encountering gaps in the record evidence, and getting around those gaps is sort of our bread and butter in many ways. But I guess to start with, when documentary evidence is missing or incomplete, where do you start when looking at strategies to get around it?
Well, it depends, as you mentioned before, on what evidence it is that's missing. If it's an absence of the person's medical records from the time in service, the court has held that there is a heightened duty on the VA to look at other evidence and to document their conclusions about alternative evidence, because as you alluded to, back in the 70s there was a fire at the main record repository in St. Louis, Missouri, that destroyed the records of a number of veterans, particularly Army veterans, also some other services, but primarily Army. And so for some of those folks, there are literally no records. In fact, we've had a few cases where they couldn't even determine that the person was in the service. I remember we had one case where we had to get photographs of the dog tags that he had saved from the service and send them in before they finally grudgingly conceded that, yes, he had been in the service. So it's all about what's missing, but it's a question of figuring out what will fill the evidentiary gap. If it's medical records that are missing, sometimes you can get expert opinions. If it's fact-based records, sometimes you need buddy statements from other folks who were in the military. It can be a whole raft of things depending on what it is that's actually missing.
So you mentioned buddy statements. When are those, well, first of all, what is a buddy statement? And second, when are they most beneficial?
Sure. Well, a buddy statement is just a colloquial VA term for a statement by someone who served in the military with the veteran who's making the claim. And those can be about literally any issue that may be relevant to the case. But just as an example, we had a case where a gentleman was at a military facility, an incoming, I think it was a helicopter, it might have been a small plane, but I think it was a helicopter, came in and crashed, and it killed several people. And he was involved in removing the bodies, and that had a debilitating effect on his mental health. He developed PTSD after that and had real serious problems. The VA did not acknowledge that this happened, but we were eventually able to find his former commanding officer, who was in Labrador, I think it was, either Labrador or Newfoundland, Labrador, I guess it was, and got a statement from him explaining that, yes, this had happened, this incoming helicopter crashed, several people were killed, our client was one of the people assigned to remove the bodies, and even if they couldn't find the records, it definitely occurred. So, it's really all about getting a buddy statement that goes to the particular issue that is present. So in a different case, for example, we were able to get buddy statements showing that the gentleman in question injured his back while he was in the service. The buddy statements were from people who had served with him and were aware of this incident where he got hurt, even though it hadn't been permanently recorded in the records.
And from my own caseload, don't let buddy be a constraining factor. I ended up with a veteran who went to somebody that he couldn't stand when they were in service together. They apparently one had snitched on the other, and then there was retaliation, and they both got stuck spraying herbicides around the fence. And our view, it was Agent Orange and the diabetes 50 years later, from the punitive herbicide spraying. And the veteran's son reached out to his former enemy's son on Facebook and, I'll talk to my dad, we'll see. And he said, I remember that. But I hate the VA more than I ever hated him. So he wrote us a pretty funny buddy statement, and I think the judge appreciated the honesty in it, and we ended up prevailing in that case. But yeah,
sometimes the circumstances are a little unusual.
Well, and the DoD is very cagey about where they'll admit to having Agent Orange and where they'll admit to having sprayed it, et cetera, et cetera. And so buddy statements can be very critical there.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess, what are some of the best practices for veterans when obtaining buddy statements to support their claims?
Well, just a couple things. I mean, one is to make sure that the buddy can actually attest to the particular fact that you're concerned about. It is not as helpful. It's still helpful, but it's not as helpful if the buddy has to say, well, I didn't see this happen, but I heard about it at the time.
Better than nothing.
That's better than nothing, but not as good as somebody who was actually there and saw it. So that's part of it. The other thing is the VA actually has a rule that all of these things are supposed to be in the form of affidavits, sworn to and all that. So it is helpful. Again, I think it adds a little bit more credence if you can get a formal notarized affidavit or a form that is sworn to under the government's kind of abbreviated system for accepting statements under penalty of perjury in lieu of having them notarized. But I think those things help a little.
I think I would also mention folks who are willing to put their contact information as part of the buddy statement too. If you have any further questions, here's, write me at this address, call me at this number, email me, whatever it is.
I agree.
Moving on from the buddy statements, one of my favorite sources of evidence to fill in the gaps is the personnel record.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how to obtain the personnel record and why it is so often the gap filler?
Yeah, we've had great results with personnel records in some cases, but getting the personnel record is usually pretty straightforward. Most of them are still in St. Louis. Some of the services have repositories in other places now, but a form, I think it's 180, filled out and sent to the records repository in St. Louis will at least get things started. If they don't have the records there, they will tell you where the records typically are. for someone who served in that period of time in that branch of service. But yeah, we've had some very interesting ones. We had one fellow who was making a claim based on injuries in Germany where the car he was driving had collided with a tram, and the service records, his individual service records, did not have any reflection of that incident. But when we got his personnel records, lo and behold, there it was. He was disciplined for improperly driving this military vehicle and colliding with a tram. So there was no question that, in fact, this accident took place. And that made it very difficult for the VA to then say that his claim that he'd been hurt in that event was not well-founded. So that was one.
And even though that was government-created evidence, it was not part of the C-file that is considered without any other special action taken on the veteran's part.
That's right. For better or worse, the VA frequently does not get the service personnel records. I don't know why, but they don't. And we had another one somewhat similar where the fellow was in an auto accident, again in Germany, and in the records he was disciplined for taking this other service member, his bunk, somebody in the same dorm, taking his vehicle without permission and getting in an accident. So, that was all in the record showing that he had this happen, and there was a record of his having been disciplined because of it. So we were able to show that it happened. And the same thing is true with mental health cases. We've had several cases over the years where the VA would not acknowledge that a series of events in service that suggested mental health difficulties. But in the personnel records, you would find Article 15s, you would find a referral for psychiatric evaluation even, stuff that just did not show up in the regular file.
Well, and oftentimes service members wouldn't seek care. The service treatment records are a lot of, when you go to sick call, things like that.
Yep.
But the juicy stuff, especially on the mental health side, and especially where folks were encouraged to sweep it under the rug.
And soldier on.
Soldier on, suck it up, buttercup. It's the Article 15s and the disciplinary documentation in the personnel record that, with the benefit of hindsight, tell the story of what was going on.
Yep.
Yeah. So for veterans who want to see their personnel records or who think there might be evidence in there that would support their claims, where do they start?
Like I said, you can just download this form from the internet. I'm quite sure it's the 180. Just download the form, and it's a request for your service medical records, and fill it out and send it in. I think you can even do it online now, although I haven't personally checked that, but I think that's correct. But you submit that, and it takes them a while, and this is a big bureaucracy after all, but they will eventually respond to the request and either send you the records or tell you that they can't find the records or that the records are held somewhere else, and they'll typically tell you where those records are.
Another one that I'd like to discuss is contemporaneous news or media reports and how those can be used to bolster a claim. Can you expound on that a little bit and how we've used those to help our clients?
Yes, we haven't even finished this case yet, but we've got one now where the gentleman was stationed in Alaska, and as you can appreciate, it's cold in Alaska. And in fact, it's so cold that what they had to do was to leave the construction equipment running overnight so that it wouldn't freeze up. In this case, what apparently happened was that the vibration from the engine sitting there idling eventually caused this bulldozer to slip into gear, and it started crawling forward. And this was in the middle of the night, and people were sleeping, and it literally bulldozed a tent with a gentleman in it, killing him. The VA claimed there was no record of this incident. We were able to get a newspaper report from the local newspaper reporting exactly what happened, exactly as our client had described it, and have submitted it to the VA. And now they're busily running around trying to get corroborating service records because they still haven't paid his claim. But they eventually are going to have to pay that claim, and they will. And one that I am very proud of, my daughter, Alexandra, who does a lot of these cases, had a case with a World War II veteran who was submitting a claim for PTSD. And he said that he had been involved in an incident toward the end of World War II where another ship that they were in convoy with was torpedoed, and his ship was involved in trying to rescue survivors and ultimately recover the bodies of those who didn't survive. The VA turned his claim down. She was able to go to the military archives and get photographs captioned with, the USS John Paul Jones or whatever it was, rescuing survivors from, the ship that had just been sunk by torpedo. And the VA actually turned around and paid that claim within 90 days after she submitted that evidence, which is amazingly quick for them. And she was very proud of that, and I was very proud of her for pulling that together and getting it in. But it's a recurring problem. The VA has tunnel vision. You have to get the evidence and put it squarely in front of them in order to get them to act.
And one other type of supporting evidence that I wanted to touch on too is, well, and I guess it's more of where you can get the evidence from, how the internet can be used to support a veteran's disability claim, because, you can find anything on the internet, but the question is whether it's true or worth anything, right?
Yeah.
And I know there's a great project out there undertaken by veterans going through ships' deck logs and charting out their movements off the coast of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And for anybody familiar with the blue water sailor presumptions, we've got an episode on that if you want to check the archives. But those deck logs and where those ships were at on what dates become very important to many claims from that era. And so by having those deck logs put into a searchable database, you can often line up from the personnel records where, what dates somebody was on a certain ship, et cetera, because oftentimes it'll just say, the port they started from and the port they ended up at. And yep. Whether you went off the coast of Vietnam or not in between
is not mentioned.
That's anybody's guess. And so by putting those deck logs, which themselves are great evidence that nobody is going to be able to pore through the entirety of, by putting them online in a systematic way, we can search the deck logs. Veterans are able to search through the deck logs and chart the movements of their ships and show how they can be entitled to that presumption.
Yes, that's very helpful. And another somewhat similar set of records that exist and can be obtained are what the Army calls morning reports. Other services call them differently, but in the Army in particular, they call these the morning reports. And for each unit, there's a report that they have a certain number of personnel assigned, and a certain number of those people are present, and the other people are accounted for in some fashion. And how it accounts for them is often important. For example, we had one gentleman who said that while he was in the service, he had a nervous breakdown, and they sent him off to the hospital at Portsmouth, Virginia. And the VA kept saying, we've checked with the hospital, they have no records, there's no sign of this. Well, after much ado, the morning reports, and we were able to show that he was absent from his unit in the relevant period. But the real kicker was there was also an entry assigning another person from his unit to escort him to the hospital. So it was very clear that, in fact, he had been hospitalized, and we ultimately were able to get him granted benefits. But, there are different ways you have to get at this. One of the things that you can do is to make a formal request for records under the Freedom of Information Act. That covers the entire government, including the military services. And while it's a slow process, you can make a request for whatever piece of information you need in the time period you need at the location. And most of the time, they will be able to produce some level of records regarding that. I mean, the records get less and less particularized as you have to go up in scope to get them. But for example, we had one gentleman who asserted that he had PTSD, and that was related to his military service, in that he had seen members of the service where he was stationed commit suicide. And of course, the VA said there are no records of this. And we were able to go to the service organization, which in this case was the Marines, and say, okay, we want a record of any deaths by suicide in this time period at this facility. And they got back to us and said, well, there were these three, and this is what happened. One really strange one was the fellow ran out in the traffic on the interstate bordering the facility and was killed. And there was one fellow that shot himself. Anyway, but the point was that, in fact, these events took place and were the basis for our client's subsequent PTSD. And it took formal request under the Freedom of Information Act to get anybody to produce the records acknowledging that these things happened.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. This has been another episode of Victory Over VA. Please be sure to subscribe and join us again next week.
We hope we'll see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.